This is Paranormal Borders Lab Podcast, brought to you by the MexiCali Biennial, with your host, Ed Gomez.
So how you feeling today?
Pretty good.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today in the Paranormal Borders Podcast. Today we have Armando Pulido. Armando, thank you for being part of this podcast today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? How'd you get involved in the arts?
Yeah, I grew up in Los Angeles, in Lennox, more specifically, which is just south of Inglewood near LAX. Both of my parents migrated there from Mexico, or they migrated to there from Mexico. So I've lived there for a very long time now, for several decades. But most of my family's still there. I kind of, grew up in LA, went to the museums in the area a lot. Well, not really, for school. But I kind of came into the arts mostly during my undergraduate coursework. I spent my first year really just taking any class that interested me or sounded interesting to me. And I came across a class called Mexicanidad, constructing a Mexican national identity, more or less. But it was taught by Professor Mary Coffey, who then became my advisor during my time at Dartmouth. And that just became like a really pivotal moment for me where I felt like I was learning a part of my own history, one that I wasn't really privy to before, that being of Mexican cultural identity, of artistic practices in Mexico from the colonial period to the modern. But it was really, eye-opening in a lot of ways because Dartmouth also has a mural by Jose Clemente Orozco that he painted while he was there in the early 1930s. And that is called The Epic of American Civilization, that Mary Coffey has since written a book about. But I think those combined experiences really just opened my eyes up to the world in a different way, in ways that I hadn't really engaged with art before and history before. The summer following that course, I took a trip to Mexico City to visit an aunt, spent some time with a friend there too, and really got to immerse myself in the cultural landscape there. And my mom is from Mexico City and hasn't been back since she came to the U.S. And so that was kind of a weird experience, kind of being there by myself. But really just getting to see everything that I was learning about in that course was like transformational in a lot of ways. And I brought back that feeling with me and those lessons with me and, learning how to question parts of my history, my own history or shared histories. And also understanding why that wasn't more mainstream in my educational background and why I had to kind of leave LA, go to New Hampshire to get that understanding and training, really.
Why do you think it wasn't so mainstream in your education?
I just feel like Mexican history wasn't something that was at the forefront of my educational career in elementary school, middle school, high school. I feel like we always had a really strong focus on American history. And to be fair, we paid a lot of attention to indigenous histories within my local communities in elementary school, which I thought was really stuck with me. So learning about the Gabrielino tribes that were, local to, native to the South Bay in LA, that was really foundational. We, of course, did the kind of mission trips that also folded in that history in some way. But speaking more to the conversion, the forced conversion to Christianity, Catholicism. But beyond that, I don't think that there was much attention paid to our relationship to Mexico, even though we have this really amazing proximity to it. And there was always more of a focus on Europe, on our ancient pasts, but never really examining our neighbor.
And not even the rich Chicano culture and history in
No,
Southern California?
Not so much. And not that I can really recall, because I remember when I learned these histories in college, I was really struck by them and kind of had this same moment happen over and over again of I should know these things and I don't. And I didn't really learn them at home. And maybe I just wasn't looking in the right places in LA either, but that's just not where that's not where, I was at the time. And it felt like it was distant in some way. But once I saw that it was here and where it was and how it's played out over decades, I felt immediately like I had to learn it. And so I tried to immerse myself as much as I could in it too.
How impactful was that for you, academically, artistically?
I think it influenced a lot of how I was approaching paper topics, research, the way I I even interacted politically on campus. I was really involved with, it was called Dartmouth Co-Fire, the Coalition for Immigration Reform, Equality, and Dreamers at the time. And that was, started before my time there, led by a group of amazing students that really pushed for, advocacy and reform in the college, which is one of the few schools that does offer resources for undocumented students in the country. So that was always a really great thing that they did, but there are many more things that come with that status that need to be kind of catered to and paid attention to in a very specific way, especially when it comes to like protections from deportation. And that we were seeing a lot of that too, because I was in college at the height of Trump was elected in 2016, and so the political climate was very heightened, and we became like really aware of the safety of students, and I think these histories felt a little intertwined in that way, and that I was kind of always thinking about the political activism that was involved in the Chicano rights movement, for example, the movement to help migrant laborers and farm workers across California even. So that just felt like a part of that in that way. And I think having that background, like learning it and then also kind of trying to enact some of those same lessons in my own spaces and communities felt really important to me. And, I think there's always just like a continuity within history and reform that we can follow to look at that too.
Speaking of the continuity in history, we're recording this podcast on January 20th, 2025. Today's the inauguration of the Trump's second administration, right? So What are the parallels are you seeing or anticipating within the next 4 years that you experienced during college back in 2016?
Yeah. I mean, it feels weird now because I think like some of that initial shock is still there, but is also like we've learned how to cope with that, or maybe I've learned how to cope with that a little bit. And it was just really in my face in 2016, as I'm sure it was for a lot of folks. And as we saw with like a lot of the political like protests that we across the country that erupted during his first presidency. But the cyclical nature is very much present in that, in the days leading up to today, there have just been mass reports of his planned deportations in major cities across the U.S., folks gearing up in Chicago, LA, New York to protect undocumented folks from deportation, instructing folks on how to like not interact with ICE, or if they are forced to interact with ICE, what to say and what to do to kind of avoid that action being taken onto them. And so it's scary in a lot of ways because I don't know, maybe like hopefully like was a little naive in my hope in that I just didn't think it was going to happen so soon. I kind of did expect it to happen again, but it's just really unfortunate. And if that's the tone that we're starting the second term with, I don't even feel like I know what to expect. Only the worst. I brace for the worst, of course. But my concerns are always just with the folks that I can immediately help and how we help each other in these times of need. And my intention has been more focused on that and how we kind of, just raise awareness for one another, but also become spaces of refuge if we need to be for each other, and, keep families intact, because this shit is real. It impacts people every day, and, it's people's families, people's spouses, children. Like the ripples are just endless.
What role do you feel like art can play in all this?
I've always taken inspiration from political posters, for example, that really came out of like labor rights movements. The UFW was really, I think, effective at that too, and involving artists in messaging out ways to support and levels of involvement. I hope that we can still use art as a form of mass communication and to combat propaganda that might be projected onto us from either the U.S. government or other private entities that are aligned with, this fascist thinking that is perpetuating these problems in the country, and are also like in very real ways enacting violence onto us. Art feels like the vehicle for even like pushing out our voices even more in that fight, and to more succinctly say, like, we are not standing for this. We will fight against it, and we are a united front that wants to help each other. And I know that artists also play a unique role in that, and that they also are taking in and, thinking about these issues, also putting their bodies on the line in different ways, but primarily also putting that into their art and helping people connect with those different histories, especially in ways that can sometimes feel remote to us, I think are present in a lot of ways. But I think with all of the information, images, messaging that we get just from every aspect of our lives, especially on the internet and the digital age, it's easy for that to get lost. So yeah, I just hope that we can continue to use it as a way to like speak for the truth and for historical truth, because these facts can't really be contended with at a certain point, and we shouldn't be censored for like projecting history. We don't necessarily write that history. We just amplify.
Sometimes make that history too while we're in the process of it too.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you see a separation between art versus activism? Do you think that they're mutually exclusive, the same, different, or do you feel like there is no separation between art and activism?
I think that they can at times exist separately. I think that art does often become like a tool of activism. And I think it's kind of hard to, I'm also like thinking of art broadly. I'm also thinking of design and just like mass communication. I think inherently has, like, I think they, like, I don't know this exactly because I'm not like a scholar on these specific things, but like in a very detailed way. But I feel like they all pull from similar principles of wanting to connect to audiences, sending out a very clear message in a concise way. But when I think of like activism, I think of all the forms that it can take, and it not just looking like a singular movement. I think of, like stickers that go on like different parts of the city that are really congested that people walk by every day, that give a clear, simple message with like an icon or terminology that people can relate to or just like get hit by in some way, like visually. I think of posters, banners that are used at protest. I think of online images that are really like proliferate very farly, with wide reach, videos that have like an equal impact. Like, I think they like art and design become essential to those processes for activism. And in that way, to me, they become really intertwined. And that's where I see the most potential for them to like coexist and work together. But I also don't think that all art is advocating for something. I think it can be political depending on how you want to read it. But, there are some things that just won't be used for advocacy in that way or activism in that way. And that's okay. But we don't necessarily have to like bring those into the fold, I don't think.
I remember having some discussions with some curators and having discussions around art and the kind of art that happens during very stressful moments and political, problems with war, the economy and stuff, and how the bad times that we're experiencing collectively as a society produces this particular type of art. And it's almost like when we go through these bad times and the really great art comes out, right? But then I also think of like Matisse and his paintings of flowers and beautiful landscapes and very colorful compositions while the Second World War was happening, right? And then you had artists like Picasso actually showing, Guernica and war and death and destruction. And I'm wondering, and it also makes me think of Shepard Fairey in a weird way, right? During the Obama Hope campaign and how impactful that was, because Obama was no longer just a presidential candidate. He was like a rock star, right? And how iconic that image was, to the point where, after the Obama presidency, everybody was like, well, where's the next Shepard Fairey poster that we can use to elect the next Democratic president or whatnot? And how important art can be, but then also, how art can also just be about art.
Yeah.
And how important sometimes that is to not have to always think that art has to do everything.
Exactly. Right? I should also say that like, it's my understanding that like art and, the field at large is also pretty subjective in a lot of ways. And I think that depending on what you need for yourself at that time too, like even if you're the one making the art and you need just a way to process that information that doesn't necessarily have to imply or like fold in these like really like, what's the word that I'm looking for? Like explicit, but also like very in a visceral kind of way too. Like that is okay. And I think it also helps us to like process a lot of these different traumas. And that is really important. In a lot of ways it helps us heal. And it's like these things have to happen simultaneously in, even within like advocating for each other. And so, Yeah, I feel like I'm someone who like sometimes wants things to like hit me in the face and like wants that messaging to be super clear and like didactic, but I also realize that like that's not always the way that's not the only way to do it too, and so that is good for me to keep in mind too. But yeah, like there's a place for it all.
Yeah, and I think I'm not sure, but I think it was Clement Greenberg's modernist painting. In that particular essay, he makes a case that art should not follow what's going on in the news. Art should be for art's sake, right? So if you have a war going on, let's not comment on that. But a lot of younger artists take this more postmodern view where they're reacting with the society and events that are happening around them. And they're putting in things that they see on television, find on the internet, and then responding to that, right? Which is a very anti-modernist approach to things, right? Because in a modernist construct, you're not supposed to comment on pop culture. It's supposed to be paint for paint's sake, or the surface is a surface, paint is paint, and it's very much about itself, right?
Yeah.
And for me, I really like that part of modernism, but then I'm also responding to what's happening around me, and I cannot separate the two at times. Right?
Yeah.
So how does that affect you as a curator? Like, do things that are happening around you, things in pop culture, politics, wars that pop up, do those affect you curatorially?
I think that I feel like it's my personal responsibility to show, again, to this idea of like continuity and like the cyclical nature of history. Like, I think there's some responsibility for me to show that connection and to show why it is that these events keep repeating themselves, that the things that we're witnessing today, we've witnessed before in the past, we likely will continue to see unless we change course dramatically in some way. And if we haven't seen it before, why the scale is so different and why it differs now. And I think in order to tell those kinds of histories, I need to be like attuned to what is happening today. I need to be tuned into like our climate disaster and condition, politics, how we deploy our troops into other nations, and even like local politics and how that affects people living today. I think art reflects a lot of the contemporary culture. Like, people often do take in like the conditions around them and make sense of it in some way, whether it's very explicit or not, ranges, as we were just saying. But I think at its core too, like, people take influence from one another. People are reading, people are, talking to each other, taking in music, pop culture, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. And that, it all it informs a product that we're all kind of working with. And I don't want to use that word product, but it's like the end result that we see in artistic spaces, or we are talking about or working with, contending with. These ideas are all kind of present at the same time. So I think for me, I just try my best to like condense them in a way that makes sense and talk about these histories in a way that people can still feel like they have some agency over, and how it directly will affect their lives. And if it's not affecting them now, it likely will affect them in the future. Just to more show the interconnectedness between past, present, future, and to each other.
And you feel like art has the ability to make changes that way?
I think art has the ability to like temporally capture that. I think that art can be interpreted in so many different ways depending on who is speaking, depending on when you're speaking, where you're speaking, that it just expands the world and our understanding of history in a broader sense that like even writing could, for example. Like when a text is written, I feel like it's, set in stone from that person in that moment, and can no longer be revised if you think of a book, but it can be like added to in the future. There can be an addendum. You can go back and like rewrite or refute your points that even you've made in the past. But for better or for worse, that text that you released at that date exists as it does, and that is still open to interpretation in many different ways. I think that art kind of exists differently from that, and that it will just have a different impact no matter when it gets picked up again. And I think that part is important too in helping to tell those stories more. because recontextualizing, I think the power within curating too is being able to put those stories side by side. So if we or I decide to pair certain objects together in ways that hadn't been before because they were looked down upon, they at least provide a new way into those histories and a new way into thinking about how we present these things alongside of each other.
I think that's an important part, new ways into those histories, and the question becomes which histories, whose history, right? And how much power the institution has in narrating those histories. The archive or the collection can protect what's in, but it also excludes everything that's outside of it, right? And you are currently working at the Huntington Museum, right, as a curatorial assistant. Are these thoughts also in your mind when you're working on projects or working with museums and larger institutions?
Yeah. The Huntington's collection is extremely extensive. The library collection is at over 12 million objects. And so the histories told there are a bit endless, but there are, of course, holes in that who they're representing too. And so that's always top of mind for me. It's like when we're putting together a story on American history, for example, are we telling the story of the victors or the folks who have written history for hundreds of years, or are we telling the stories of those that were displaced, those that were forcibly removed from their lands, those that were forcibly brought into the nation and subjugated to work the land for no pay, for forms of imprisonment that still exist today. And so that feels important to me. I always think about who's narrating those histories, where those documents are coming from. And that, I feel like, is a practice that is brought no matter where I am. And that's always kind of assessing like local need, how those local stories then inherently become a more national, international story. How, we create place, names, symbols, signs for our locales that affect us every day, but we kind of lose those parts of history too, but how those things still affect us now. And so I always try to at least prioritize a multiplicity of voices too, in order to paint that fuller picture. And to say that while there are like a number of marginalized groups in this country, that there are some shared experiences amongst them and us, but each one has its own specificities too. And that there's a lot to like pull out and honor in those stories and histories, and a lot of like shared collective trauma that we still need to like process together. And the more that we know about each other, I think the more clear the path forward is.
What about when the institution gets things wrong?
In what way?
Well, like excluding voices, perspectives. And I only ask this because these are questions that my students also ask me. Like one question that I always get asked is like, art's cool, but it's not for me. Or I go to a museum and I don't see myself represented. I don't see my story represented, my people, my heritage, my culture. I go to a museum, but I can't really get into it because the price of admission is too high.
Yeah.
And so, and it goes down again to what we've been talking in previous episodes about who's the art for, right? And if it's not for everyone, then who's it for? And if it's supposed to be for everyone and it's not, then how do we change that?
Yeah. I mean, I think having worked in like different curatorial roles, I think that my like understanding of that has also like been more informed by the different kinds of audiences that we always think about speaking to. I think there's always like the audience that I want to engage most is that audience that doesn't feel like they're represented and that doesn't necessarily feel welcome. Like these are often like very elite spaces that were not built for marginalized folks, underrepresented folks, the working class especially, that like price of admission is prohibitive for a reason. And it's often, I think, hidden under the guise of we need to be like a financially viable space. Institutions, museums, which is true, we need to sustain them in some way. But as we've seen in LA especially, like a lot of wealthy donors and philanthropists have like provided large sums of money to make that a goal. And that's an institutional priority that you then, that's like a person-to-person relationship in some ways. And it's an institutional one. And so I think that the question of like audience and engagement, it's so tiered depending on like how much money you have, how much money you're donating to the institution, what your relationship is to bringing in art there, like, and also like, you know, you're always kind of speaking to a community of artists, scholars, researchers who do also do a lot of that work, but the scholarship that helps build and sustain us, and I think that we all kind of, you know, contribute to and are inspired by. So it's always, I think, thinking about all of that at once, but then deciding who you want to cater to the most, at least from my perspective, because once you kind of build, and this was a lesson I kind of learned early on, I feel, was that when you don't see yourself represented in these spaces, you either have to kind of create them for yourself or really push for that representation to happen. But like by and large, when you make a show for, you know, those communities that you're not seeing come out, those folks will always come out, and they will come out in numbers. And, you know, that's kind of, it always goes to prove that point too, that it's worth doing, and people just haven't had their stories told in this way. So we should be doing more of it. And, you know, I'm just glad to be in that position where I feel like I can tell more of those stories, because they also feel like they're my stories. And in that sense, it makes it easier to do that work, because there's some sense of like ownership to it. And, you know, and there's stories that I wasn't seeing either growing up sometimes. And I'm seeing more of them now, which I'm really happy about and inspired by. But, you know, I think it's just part of the same system.
I thought it was interesting how you said you had to go to the East Coast in order to get an understanding of what was happening in Southern California, which is similar to me. Like I graduated from a graduate program that really prioritized a Eurocentric or East Coast idea of conceptualism. Mm-hmm. We didn't cover Chicano art at all, right? And so I had to play a lot of catch up when I graduated, and like realize that there's a history and there's a culture and there's an art community making work that was completely foreign to me, because everything was filtered through this European kind of understanding of art making. And the first time I even came into contact with art was through Jansen's Art Through the Ages art book. And, you know, it's an art book that's probably like several inches thick, and the majority of it is all the old crusty stuff, right? It was broken up into like Renaissance to antiquity, and then, you know, or Gothic, and then Renaissance to contemporary. And as I went through and learned art history through this book, I realized that a lot of it has to do with Christianity and dead people. And if you wanted to be a good painter, you had to be not only dead but also Spanish, because all the great painters are Spanish. And it was a very, very limited kind of Western view of art that was filtered through this chronology of, you know, antiquity through modern and contemporary art, which was the smallest section of the book, by the way, with very few color reproductions. And I'm wondering like how that impacts the next generation of art students, are people getting in contact with art. I think now in art history, there's a push to really make things thematic. To leave behind this idea of a chronology of events, this linear idea of art history, because I don't think art history was ever linear, right? At any given moment, you have artists exploring a multitude of different mediums and forms of representation. I remember seeing this diagram by Alfred Barr, and it kind of tried to map out the connection between Cubism and modernism. And it becomes this almost like rhizome type of diagram with connections between Fauvism and Cubism and Pointillism, trying to trace the origins of modern art. And I think maybe that gets closer to what we're talking about in terms of art history and audience. But maybe that two-dimensional image projected in a three-dimensional space. And that at any given moment, artists are doing political art or non-political art, figurative, abstract. But the art history book always tries to say that, you know, figurative came before abstraction, and then, you know, the pyramids came before this, and there's always this linear, straight chronology of events. But then I think about Piet Mondrian, and he was, making his flower paintings at the same time he was doing his neoplastic constructivist work, right? So simultaneously he was doing representational floral arrangements, at the same time really minimal geometric abstraction, or even Picasso doing his neoclassical period at the same time he was working with Cubism. And I think that art history is kind of needs to be re-examined that way. And I think that the art institution and the museum also needs to go through that.
Yeah. I, like, on a personal, like, note, like, or scale, like, I have been contending a lot with even the thought of, like, museums being, like, inherent colonial spaces that, looted cultural objects and artifacts from other places. And I always think of, like, spaces like the British Museum or the Met or, even LACMA, where a lot of these objects, like, don't necessarily belong to us, but because we take them in the name of, like, care and conservation and, being able to share their messages more widely with different audiences, it's kind of validated in a way. But, like, it's hard to also, like, at once kind of be opposed morally to that and to understand that, like, those things should have never been taken from their original contexts. Even if we think that we know better, we don't. But, and then having to, like, also go in every day and, like, kind of uphold that same level of thinking when I am doing my work in these settings. And that's tough, but that's also like I don't think that all, like, that art shouldn't be cared for. I don't think that, like, that art should, like, that these institutions should be destroyed entirely and that they should cease to exist for this function. I think it's amazing that we get to care for these artifacts that tell the story of, like, human history, like, they now kind of belong to everyone because they are stored in this way and they've been shown in this way. And I think there are curators who are doing really great work to recontextualize the way that we show them and talk about them and present them in the most honest and genuine way that we can. That's also, like, not a step at, like, it's a step behind giving it back entirely. But, it's something that the discipline, I think, as a whole needs to contend with. And that's, we really don't want to give up, our treasures, but sometimes they're not ours, and that's okay. And it's hard. I don't have a perfect answer for it. I think we can start by continuing all the repatriation that we've been doing and bringing in folks from, like, different communities, like indigenous communities and different nations that should have their cultural objects back. But that is kind of, like, at the core for me as well. But again, I don't know what, like, a perfect solution is to that.
Yeah, for me too, it's always interesting the power that the institution has. You can get a water bottle like this and just put it in a vitrine and put it in a museum setting. It's, like, magically transformed into a cultural significant artifact, right? I think Piero Manzoni did a project like that where it's just a pedestal and you can put your feet on the pedestal and you immediately get transformed into a living work of art because of the power of the pedestal has and art history and the context and how that magically becomes transformed into something else. And I think that, museums have that power, right? You can go to a museum and you can see objects and tools or artifacts that were never intended to be works of art. They were completely functional, and then they magically get transformed into something that they were never intended to be. Do you think about that when you are also creating, the power that the curator has in recontextualizing objects?
I think I'm, like, the example that comes to mind, like, most frequently when thinking about that too. And I guess I will add that I don't think I've had to work with, that's not true. In my, like, direct, like, in, like, the scope of the projects that I've worked on, I've never had to, like, work directly with those objects. But, like, I think often of, like Native American baskets, or, like, pottery, that if it's, like, found out in the open, like, those communities maybe don't want you to come, like, take them anywhere. Don't touch them, just leave them there. That's where they live. Like, those objects have a life of their own. Like, they should not be tampered with in that way. And yeah, sorry, I'm kind of forgetting the question, but that was the thought that came to me at the time. Like,
and then the museum goes in there, and the curator takes it, and then they turns them into, puts them in an exhibition about pattern and abstraction or something, right? Like something crazy outside of its original context.
Exactly. And that's when I think that like you can have people come in and like, I love like one of my favorite exhibitions of the last few years was called The Portable Universe at LACMA that dealt with pre-Columbian art in Colombia, and it was really about like gold, like the gold that was used to produce these like amazing art objects, like objects that were just like used in daily life, but that land and the lakes were mined to no end after colonization or during colonization, and there's not really anything left there, and those objects were then taken out of these like indigenous communities, put into these museums. But in creating that show, the curators there worked directly with those indigenous communities. They visited them for like weeks at a time, brought them to LACMA to like bless the space at the very end of the show, and really tried to like contextualize the work as closely as like it would have originally been presented in, where they're in their place of origin. And that was super impactful for me to witness, because I had never even like, I didn't know that we even wanted to do that, like it was nice to see that like, if you can bring in those folks, that work can be done together, and that feels like a closer solution in like working with our collections as they are today.
I think about that. In my previous life, I worked as an art preparator at LACMA, and then working with different institutions that have mummies. Like, and always thinking to myself, like, this person never wanted to be on display.
Yeah.
Their tomb should never have been raided, but yet here these mummies are being paraded around and put on display. People are paying admission to go see these bodies and these sacked and vandalized tombs and all the artifacts that have been taken from them, and for entertainment purposes, but also the institution gets to make money off of it, right? And it goes to the question is like, is that okay to do? It's been normalized, popularized. I even worked on when in the early 2000s when they brought back the King Tut tour. I remember being called in to come in early at 4 o'clock in the morning to dust all the artifacts off of King Tut's dagger and some of the artifacts that were on display there, and using compressed air to try to get the dust off of his dagger and jewelry, because I wasn't allowed to touch any of that.
Yeah.
But thinking to myself, like, people are paying money to see this. This was never intended to be put on public display. But yet it's been normalized, and it's okay. Other institutions having Native American remains, right?
Yeah.
So, like, what is that about? Like, are we just living through this legacy of decades of institutions parading bodies and body parts and ransacking tombs, and it's now all normalized and okay? Or what's the future generation going to do to our artifacts or our bodies or our knowledge, right?
Yeah, I think there's so much at play there. I was like automatically thinking about like how we also have like created such an industry out of death, like, and embalming and like ceremony, and some of that has a place, and I think that's really worth like talking about. But like people make a ton of money off of just like selling caskets too, which is kind of a crazy thing. And like like that process of embalming and like how we present the bodies, like it's so ingrained. But I feel like there are even like underlying, and I feel like I've heard about, like I learned about this somewhere, I think like on a show, so I'm not just making this up, but like
unless the show is making it up.
Yeah. There's like a whole market that was born out of, just death. And so in a society that kind of feeds off of death in that way, like I'm not surprised that we are so comfortable parading it like that. And having human remains in your collections is just like absolutely bonkers to me, and should not, like, why?
Or like, was it the Victorian mummy wrapping ceremonies where like you could order a mummy and everybody would get together and you'd unwrap the mummy in your home, right? Or using ground up mummy as medicine, or mummy brown. The origins of this color, mummy brown, is like the ground up remains of these bodies that they would dig up.
Oh no.
And it's like the complete disregard of what it is
Yeah.
to at that point, it's just an object, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in that way, it's like a different kind of relationship to life too, because once it's like someone is no longer living, does that make it okay to consider them an object? You know, like I personally think that a body should return to the earth as it, you know, as we came out of it, but it's a different way of thinking, and that it's a kind of scary.
It's also tied into Catholicism, right? Because every Catholic church or chapel has a remain of a saint, right? Like there's a body part or some part of a saint that's part of that structure. I remember going to Italy, and we went to the chapel where Bernini's Ecstasy of Saint Teresa is at, and I remember trying to communicate to the Italian monk through my Spanish and his Italian, and we were trying to figure out exactly where the holy relic was. And he told me that embedded into this pillar was the heart that they took out of St. Teresa and placed inside the pillar. But that the rest of her body's been spread out throughout various locations around the world, so that the church or the chapel or the people in that community have a connection to that particular saint, right? And like, what is that about, right?
Yeah. It's like staking claim in some way almost, or having that physical connection. In that way, I think it's like, it's interesting to think about the power of the object and like how much significance we play into like physical manifestations of these beliefs. In this case, a body part. But like cultural objects, like objects that we house in museum collections are that to me, you know, like I think it's easier for me to understand history when I see a physical representation of it in front of me, and all art is kind of that. And maybe that's just something that we as humans are kind of conditioned to and crave and want to make meaning out of these things in front of us. But I don't know where like the limit kind of comes with like the human body itself becoming that object. And I know that like bones in some way are that too, but I don't know, like fossils to me feel like a more like acceptable way of approaching that idea.
So it's okay if we don't have the dinosaurs' consent to put the bones on display, but
well, yeah, it's like if you need time to pass, I think millions of years is maybe a fair amount. I mean, we're burning them every day in our cars.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's like, you know, it's interesting because then that idea of like time, like sediment layering, like the earth, like it all becomes a part of it too. And we're like literally excavating these things out of the earth, like all of it, you know? And so how much of that is also our own desire to like want just a piece of the earth, of history with us at all times? I don't know.
I remember when I went to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and there's that bronze sculpture of St. Peter. When you get up close to it, you notice that the foot has been completely worn off. There's no definition at all on the feet because of so many people going up and touching that. They want that physical connection to that object, and in doing that, that becomes real, right? It's not just an image or a picture; it becomes a physical object that you've touched, that you've been a part of, or you know, and you know, during the Renaissance, people would carry mirrors with them when they did pilgrimages, and they would hold the mirror up so that the image that they're experiencing would be captured in the mirror. So when they took the mirror home with them, they knew that mirror once contained the image of that holy relic or that holy place that they had visited. And that was their way of like creating that physical connection with something that's, in that case, far away. Yeah. But it's something, you know, very human in that. And I think, you know, even today, I remember the first time I went to go see Van Gogh's Starry Night, how much of that painting was very much like a celebrity. People were lining up to get their portraits or their pictures taken in front of that painting, similar to like wanting your picture taken in front of a movie star, right? Yeah. But it's just a painting, and I think there's something very human in that. Now, part of this podcast is also talking about and helping us to define what the paranormal is. Right? What is normal versus what is paranormal, and looking at the intersections or the connections between those two, between art and the paranormal. So one question I always like to ask our guests is, have you ever had a paranormal experience?
Listen, I'm sure I have. I'm a believer. I don't want to acknowledge it. Like I get scared. Like if I'm home alone and I hear things creaking or cracking, things closing, like I I believe that they're not evil, not malicious. I kind of just let them do their thing. I kind of acknowledge mentally that they were here before me, and if you want to roam, please roam. Just don't bother me. And I know that like you are supposed to talk to the spirits if you like hear them or feel their presence. But like growing up, I was just always taught to believe that. And like I don't know if my siblings were always just trying to scare me because I was a scaredy cat growing up, but they would always like try to spook me or like say that they saw something in the closet or like an apparition appear. But like we collectively just never really like believed that they were fake, you know, like they were made up. We always kind of like acknowledged the presence of something at sometimes. And like I feel like that was true. And I carry that with me today. I had this story from my aunt, my tia Araceli, who like had this, like she and my mom, their sisters have like I've always been really receptive to these things too. And so I kind of grew up with this thinking reinforced by them. And she has this kind of amazing story that I'm not going to get the details right of, but she was essentially visiting a town in Mexico with my uncle. And she wanted to visit a saint that the town was kind of, like the saint came from this town and they had a church built kind of around this. And so it only has like a night there. So she goes the day she gets there. She and my uncle visit. They like kind of go to the church. The church is attended by one person. They kind of go in. She notices that there's like a vitrine with something missing. She like says her prayers. She says thank you to the person like cleaning. Like it was like a janitor cleaning the church who let them in. She goes home, and the next day, like before she leaves, she wants to go back to thank them. And she goes, like the church is locked. She can't find anyone there. She kind of walks around and she finds someone who can finally help her get in. And she asks like, oh, like I came to say thank you to the person that was working here yesterday. Like, do you know where I could find them? And the person looks at her and says like, I don't know who you spoke to because I'm the only person with keys here and I wasn't here yesterday. And she's like, no, but I was here yesterday. Like I remember being like, I was here with my husband, and my uncle was like, yeah, like we visited. And he's like, I don't know who that was, but like, that's like, I can let you in again and you can come in. And so she went in, and she realized that the vitrine with the missing object now was filled. And she kind of had this like moment of like piecing it together for her. And, you know, she came with that intent to go see the saint, and she had that experience on the first day that really stuck with her. But it had this like unexplainable interaction where she couldn't find the person that let her in the first day. And, you know, there was just no explanation to that story.
What was in the vitrine?
I think it was like a baby, like a baby Jesus kind of figurine type of thing. Like, you know, like back to the human kind of like body connection. Like it was something like that. I don't think it was like a baby Jesus like sculpture, but something of that sense that spoke to the saint. Again, I'm not getting the details completely right, but that was like the general like gist of it.
How do you explain that? Like what is that? Is it like, okay, so I think in one model you could be like, oh, this person traveled to an alternative timeline, right? Like,
right. I've never even thought about that. Yeah.
You know, like you thought yourself into one plane of existence where nothing was in the vitrine, and then something happened where you slipped into a different parallel universe, and now there is something in that vitrine, right? And the question is, do we do that all the time, or is it just the matrix kind of messing up and it's made aware? Is more evident sometimes than others, or ghost, or
I've always thought it was ghost. I'm like, my tia came with the mission. She was not going to take no for an answer.
Have, right? Like,
yeah, like she had 24 hours and she made use of it. And I was like, of course, like it's going to happen to her. Like she's like receptive to that kind of those things happening, you know. And I've never once questioned it. And when I heard the story, I was just like so taken aback by it. And like, yeah, I wrote about it like in my 9th grade, like personal essay. My teacher told me she was struck by it. Like I don't know, like it was just a story that like really like stuck with me and stuck with her and my family. And so I've always just thought that like it was like the supernatural presence that wanted her to be there that day. And she, you know, like that's just my understanding of it.
Yeah, because when I first heard it, I'm like, oh, that's a perfect prank. right? Like,
That's true too. Yeah, that could be it.
But if the object in the vitrine was missing, then
Yeah.
that's a more elaborate prank. Then that's harder to pull off, right?
Exactly.
That's something that I would, as a teen, I probably would have said like, "Oh no, I'm the only person that's here," like just to mess with somebody.
And maybe she embellished. I don't know her to be someone who embellishes, but that could be a possibility too.
It's funny because my sisters also have a story kind of similar where they went to this church in San Diego and there was this apparition or the stain where they saw the face of Jesus in this particular church, and they years later went back to that church and that stain or that image of Jesus never existed. They went to the same church. They talked to everybody there. Then everyone they met were like, no, there was never an image of that here. And the person that you described never really ever worked here. I've been at this church for X amount of years.
Wow.
And so they experienced two completely different events at the same location, right? And so the question is like, why, right? Maybe in some weird kind of model, we could talk about parallel universes, alternative forms of existence, and or the Matrix just had a hiccup or something, or it's something that's next to normal, like this.
I mean, I honestly really believe that like parallel universe exists, and that like there is a timeline where like Trump is not being inaugurated today, for example.
The bullet didn't miss, right? Like there's one timeline
Exactly.
where that happened.
Yeah, like I think that's like that has to exist. Like in a world of like this much probability and possibility, like there's just no way. And like I think about that idea of like, and I feel like this was like more communicated in like movies recently, but like one decision really does alter the course of your life, or can. And like, like if I hold that to be true, where do I find space for like how often do we switch in and out of those? And I never thought about that. Like I hadn't really considered that. I just kind of accepted like, oh, like parallel universe, I'm kind of in the worst possible one right now, which is not always true.
But sometimes you get lucky.
Yeah, but it's like, okay, like I can deal with it. Like but I kind of make peace with that too. Of like, I know somewhere else it's better, but here it's this.
You can also think about this through linguistic models, because you can talk about the world outside of these walls being horrible and terrible, and at any moment you're going to get shot by a random stray bullet, or you're going to get cancer, and you're constantly being discriminated against and being talked badly of, and then you kind of create that existence, that filter, that way of looking at the world around you. You can also walk out the door and be like, today's going to be the best day ever, and how much of that actually manifests and happens. And I think about this in the morning where I'm walking in the neighborhood and I see a random stranger or someone walking their dog, and I'm like, hey, good morning. Like, what does that mean, right? Am I casting a spell telling this person that they're going to have a good morning versus have a crappy morning, right? Like, and even those simple words can have an effect on how someone's perception is formed, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, thank you, all. We'll have a good morning today. Or like, you're an asshole to me. You're a jerk. It's going to change the way I think and act and move throughout space. And as a kid, it was always like, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. But now I'm like, words are powerful spells.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Like, how are we going to cast these spells? Like, we all learned spelling for a reason. And what kind of a world are we going to make, And maybe that's another way of experiencing a parallel universe or an alternate universe, right?
Yeah.
Like a certain person gets elected, everything's going to go to crap. Or maybe there's another way of thinking or seeing it.
Yeah. And that to me also like makes me think of like a personal belief that I have that like, and like it's like if we want to live in a better world, we have to be able to imagine a better world. And I think that that's also kind of informed by like, if there are more of us that believe in that better world, the more likely it is to happen. And to kind of go into your point of like that collective kind of memory action, summoning in some way, like I think, I don't know, I want to believe that that's true, because that's how I also kind of like keep faith in the world and like have a belief of like, okay, this won't always be this way. And it's like through our like union and like shared beliefs in a better system and society that like we can make that happen together.
Yeah. I think that the other component to that is action.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Others may not even think that. They'd be like, oh no, you can just think it and that's powerful enough. Right. But I think from a practical standpoint, you have to
Yeah.
have both. You have to have that belief system, that thing that you want to change, and then taking action for that change.
Yeah. And that sometimes can be the harder part to like enact those like ideologies or those ideals. But, you know, again, like the more people buy into that shared thinking, maybe the easier it is to enact or like to act it in real life, you know? So
Yeah, we have to visualize it in order for it to even be considered something viable, right?
yeah.
Like everything in this room, for example, is designed by somebody that started out as a thought form or an idea that got translated into like a drawing, then became physical, right? And that's that part of the equation. But I think it starts out with words and thoughts.
Yeah.
Right.
Is that how you built this room?
That's how I built it. That's how the room built itself, right?
Exactly.
I'm just watching. I remember running across some more esoteric writings about the existence of the universe and this idea that the universe creates itself and destroys itself 20 billion times a second. And there's this constant influx of being made visible and invisible, present and not present. And it's that same exact little element that gets repeated over and over and over again, that it's the same fabric that creates existence itself. And then start getting into conversations about the one being the whole and everything being part of the one and that kind of stuff. But
That breaks my brain.
yeah, it's a little too much for this episode.
No, but it's fascinating, you know?
Yeah. So what kind of advice would you give to younger artists or students that are interested in learning and researching and maybe being a curator and studying art history?
I think that the base for me has always been to just, you know, remain authentic to where, like, to be authentic to who you are. I think there's also so much value within that, like honoring your roots and just always like remembering where you come from. That's always been super pivotal for me and critical in a lot of ways. Like I feel that I've had a very unique path to get to like where I am right now in my life, and so like every step has never been lost on me, or at least I like to think so. And I think that when you have that genuine interest and the genuine passion, or just like a desire to create, to research, to read, to write, that will always resonate with someone else who shares that equal level of like compassion, desire, curiosity, intrigue. Like I feel like when you put that out, you kind of naturally find those folks that will give that back to you in some way. And those are always the more like fruitful interactions for me. And those like not that they have to be, you know, but like I like to ask questions. And so when I ask someone something and they will like answer in a really genuine way, like I just want to know more. And then like I will share, you know, even more too, because I know that like it's a space for that. But I feel like that's been at the core of so much of the work too, is always just like it's been a curiosity for like why our lives are the way they are today, why our society is the way it is today, but also like just like the weird parts of history that like we don't really talk about, that like have some relationship to us but are also kind of forgotten. And like that all becomes like unearthed through like a shared practice of information sharing, of communication, of, you know, like even kinship. And like it's been so amazing in a lot of ways to see how much like all parts of this ecosystem interact, like artists, researchers, like even administrators that make the day-to-day happen for so many of us. Like everyone has a shared invested interest in this, and, you know, with the ultimate end goal of sustaining this environment and ecosystem for us. And so I think a lot of it is kind of that personal piece, but also just like not being afraid to ask those questions, to always like probe whenever you can. And there will come a point too where I think you kind of realize that you are kind of the expert in some of these topics, that everyone in the room is also maybe equally learning, even if some people don't want to admit it. And that there's a lot of like flexibility in that and freedom in that too. And like learning how to just like navigate that is hard, but that's why you also should also like connect, reach out to your peers and to use like those resources around you, and to never be afraid to like reach out to folks. I know I'm always super happy to like just help anyone who has general curiosity or questions about how to navigate these spaces, because they're also like inherently exclusive, and that's always the most daunting task. Like the things that I was always told coming into the field was like the hardest part is just getting your foot in the door, and I think that's kind of proven to be true. So as much as that as we can do for each other, I think is super important, because there's really space for everyone. There's so much work to do and like so much history to like really share with one another that it's endless. Like there is no, like, history has been written for us in so many ways, and we really like we have to and we've seized that control in a lot of ways, but there are still many more ways that we can take that back for ourselves. And that's coming as from the Latino experience as a queer person, but also in many other ways. And I think that there's just so much to be said and done. So just follow genuine interests, connect with other people, and don't be afraid to ask, disrupt a little bit.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Armando, for being part of the Paranormal Borders podcast, and we're excited to continue, working with you in the future projects. And how could people find you or follow you? Are you on social media or?
Yeah. On social media under my full government name, Armando Pulido Jr. Working with MexiCali Biennial. We'll be opening Ed's show this week, Sacred Disruption.
That's a whole nother podcast, by the way.
Yeah, it is. So just plugging that now for the future. But also
at the Huntington, you're working on a big project.
At the Huntington, I will be contributing to an exhibition looking at 250 years of American history through land, which is opening in June 2026.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for being part of the Paranormal Borders podcast.
Thanks for having me.